The lively evening on Waterloo Bridge in London in 1978 was no different from hundreds before it. Crowds of people hurrying to bus stops, the city noise, and a light mist over the Thames created a perfect backdrop for everyday life. Amidst this human stream, a tall, middle-aged man felt a sharp but fleeting pain in the back of his thigh, as if bitten by an annoying mosquito or brushed by a branch. Turning around, he saw only a polite stranger who awkwardly dropped his umbrella and, muttering apologies, quickly disappeared into the crowd, catching a taxi. This accidental prick marked the beginning of an irreversible countdown. The gentleman's ordinary accessory, designed to protect from rain, concealed within it a triumph of engineering thought, aimed at the silent and guaranteed completion of a human path. Inside the tip was hidden a tiny reservoir and a complex compressed gas system that delivered a microscopic capsule, no more than 1.5 millimeters in size, into the target's body. This moment on the bridge became a symbol of an entire era when the genius of scientists was put at the service of an invisible front, and familiar household items turned into carriers of final silence. In the shadow of the great confrontation between two superpowers, another arms race unfolded, hidden from public view and even from most military personnel. It was a competition of minds working in closed laboratories, where the boundaries between scientific progress and the creation of tools of elimination were finally blurred. The tension of the Cold War demanded tools that would allow political problems to be solved without noise, without traces, and, most importantly, without the possibility of proving the involvement of a particular state. The era of plausible deniability arrived, when any tragic incident had to look like a natural malfunction of the body or a ridiculous accident. Engineers working for special services became peculiar alchemists of the 20th century, only instead of gold, they sought ways to perfectly deliver fatal substances. Their workshops were not huge factories, but jewelry workshops and chemical laboratories, where every screw and every spring underwent multiple reliability tests in real city conditions. The creation of such devices required a deep understanding not only of mechanics, but also of biology, physics, and even the psychology of the masses. The outer layer of the conflict lay on the surface of the world political map. States needed to eliminate key figures of the enemy in such a way as not to provoke an open military conflict. Ordinary firearms were too loud, too obvious, and left too many clues. Therefore, the attention of designers shifted to items that do not arouse suspicion during inspection. A common pen, a popular brand lighter, or even lipstick became the shell for complex mechanisms. For example, one of the developments was a cigarette case that, when a button was pressed, ejected not a cigarette, but a portion of gas that caused instantaneous paralysis of the heart muscle. From the point of view of an outside observer, the person simply clutched their heart and slowly sank to the ground, struck by a sudden ailment, which happened to thousands of people daily in those years. The technical perfection of these devices was astonishing. To conceal the mechanism inside the umbrella, engineers had to solve the problem of creating a miniature pneumatic drive capable of operating absolutely silently. The capsule, made of a platinum-iridium alloy, had two tiny holes, less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter, drilled at an angle. Inside was a toxic compound that, upon entering the warm environment of the human body, would slowly seep out through these pores. This provided a time delay, allowing the operative to leave the scene long before the target felt the first signs of indisposition. The entire mechanism was hidden inside the umbrella shaft, and even the most thorough visual inspection would not reveal the trick, unless one knew exactly where to press to activate the combat mechanism. Behind every such invention lay the personal drama of its creator. It was an internal conflict of people who, by their nature, were creators. Engineers, radio-electronics specialists, doctors. They lived in closed cities, had unlimited funding, but their names were never to appear in scientific journals. Their ambitions were satisfied by the complexity of the tasks set before them. Imagine a designer ordered to create a device capable of transmitting sound from an ambassador's office without a single power source and without wires. It seems impossible, but in the mid-1940s, such a problem was solved. The device, known as Zlatoust, Chrysostom, was a passive resonator hidden in a wooden panel in the shape of the United States coat of arms. It had no electronics in the usual sense, emitted no signals, and could remain in standby mode for decades. It was activated by external irradiation at a specific frequency from across the street. It was a masterpiece of passive reconnaissance that hung on the wall in the most protected place for 7 years before it was accidentally discovered. The creator of this device, the brilliant inventor of the theremin, combined a passion for music with an incredible understanding of radio waves, working in conditions of complete secrecy. The motivation of such specialists often lay beyond simple ideology. For many, it was an intellectual challenge. How to deceive nature itself and the laws of physics to achieve an impossible result. They competed with colleagues from across the ocean, trying to anticipate what defense system they would build next. It was a chess game where the pieces were not people, but technological solutions. However, behind the blueprints and diagrams always lurked the fear of error. One incorrectly calculated gram of pressure, one jammed valve, and the operation failed, and the operative was at risk of exposure. The psychological pressure on the engineers was enormous because their products had to work with 100% guarantee in any climatic conditions, from humid jungles to the frosty streets of capitals. The ideological level of this confrontation touched the very foundations of morality. Can we call the improvement of elimination tools progress? This is a paradox of civilization. Humanity spent its best intellectual resources on learning how to end the lives of its own kind, as elegantly and imperceptibly as possible. The clash of values here manifested in the fact that science, intended to prolong life and cure diseases, was used for diametrically opposite purposes. Pharmacology created substances that left no traces in the blood during an autopsy, and micromechanics made these substances instruments of surgical precision in political games. This was a perversion of the very essence of engineering, where success was measured not by the number of lives saved, but by the effectiveness of completed tasks, which would never be written about in history textbooks as achievements. A real revolution in the perception of these systems occurred when the world realized the scale of invisible technology's penetration into everyday life. For a long time, it was believed that spy gadgets were the domain of cinema and science fiction novels. But when the veil of secrecy began to lift, society saw a frightening reality. It turned out that even an ordinary stone in a park could be a high-tech communication node, and a lighter in a neighbor's pocket could carry a charge capable of blinding or paralyzing at a distance of several meters. This discovery changed the concept of security. Attention shifted from searching for obvious threats, such as bombs or rifles, to analyzing microstructures and accidental contacts. The understanding that danger could emanate from any household item spawned a new wave of paranoia in the highest echelons of power, leading to even more sophisticated methods of protection and counterintelligence. The situation changed dramatically with the advent of the digital age. Mechanical devices, however perfect they might be, began to give way to electronic and biological systems. The moment of truth came when engineers realized that physical contact was no longer a prerequisite for achieving a goal. However, the legacy of the engineers of silence did not disappear. It transformed into cybernetic systems capable of disabling entire infrastructures without a single shot. The culmination of this long history is that good old umbrellas and fountain pens became the foundation for understanding how covert influence works. We understood that the most effective system is one whose existence the target doesn't even suspect until the very last moment. The denouement of many operations involving such devices was often tragic, not only for the targets, but also for the perpetrators. History knows cases where agents accidentally activated their own traps or fell victim to the imperfection of early prototypes. Each such incident forced designers to return to the drawing board, adding new levels of safeguards and complicating already incredible mechanisms. In this final clash of ideas, man always remained the weakest link, and the task of engineers was to minimize the human factor as much as possible, making the device virtually autonomous. Today's resonance of these events forces us to look at the ethical dilemmas of modernity in a new light. We live in a world where technology develops faster than our notions of law and morality. Past experience shows that any scientific achievement can be dual use. The same principles of miniaturization that allowed the creation of an umbrella capsule are now used in medicine for targeted drug delivery to affected cells. This is an important lesson. Technology itself is neutral, and only human will determines its vector. By studying the history of invisible masters, we see a reflection of our own fears and ambitions. We understand that the pursuit of control and security often leads humanity into dark labyrinths, where finding a way out is extremely difficult. The lessons of those years are relevant even in the era of global digitalization. Now, invisible devices have become algorithms and software codes that can influence the behavior of masses as imperceptibly as a prick on Waterloo Bridge. We must realize that the tools of influence have become even more subtle and pervasive. This requires from us not only technical literacy, but also critical thinking, the ability to recognize hidden mechanisms of influence in the flow of information. The modern engineer of silence is no longer a man with a file at a workbench, but a programmer at a monitor. But the essence of their activity remains the same: finding vulnerabilities and creating solutions that bypass any defense. Concluding this dive into the world of hidden systems, we inevitably return to that very man on the bridge. His story ended 4 days after the incident, and doctors for a long time could not understand the reason for the sharp deterioration of his condition. Only through the most thorough investigation and a stroke of luck was it possible to discover that microscopic capsule, which became the key to unraveling an entire network of secret operations. This brings us back to the idea of the fragility of human life in the face of technical genius directed at destruction. That umbrella, left in a taxi, will forever remain in memory as a reminder that behind the facade of the familiar world, there is always the hidden work of minds capable of turning the mundane into a trap. The history of these devices is not just a chronicle of technical achievements. It is a chronicle of human ingenuity, constrained by the rigid framework of political necessity. It teaches us to be attentive to details and to understand that true power often lies in silence. Looking at modern gadgets, we sometimes do not consider what past technologies formed their basis. But every time we see something surprisingly compact and effective, it is worth remembering those invisible masters who, for decades, honed the art of hidden action, ahead of their time and setting standards that still inspire awe and admiration with their terrifying flawlessness. Decades have passed, and many of those secret laboratories have been disbanded and the blueprints destroyed or hidden in deep archives. However, the very idea of invisible influence continues to evolve. If previously a physical object was required, now a radio signal or a line of code is sufficient. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. The ideal device is one that you will not notice, even if it is right before your eyes. We are surrounded by a world of things, and each of them has its own story, sometimes much more complex and dangerous than it might seem at first glance. Looking back into the past, we see that the engineers of silence were a kind of mirror of their era, a time of paranoia, brilliant insights, and harsh pragmatism. Their legacy is not only museum exhibits with false bottoms, but also a deep philosophical question about the limits of what is permissible in the defense of national interests. We must remember this when assessing new technological horizons, because history tends to repeat itself, changing only the forms and scales of its instruments. That old injection on a London street continues to resonate in the modern security system, reminding us that vigilance and knowledge are the only defense in a world where even rain can become a cover for someone's filigree and fatal design. Every object in the hands of a master can become more than it seems. An ordinary gentleman's accessory, a modest lipstick in a lady's handbag, a shiny lighter in the hands of a passerby, all these were milestones on the path to creating the ideal control system. The engineers of those years reached heights that still seem fantastic today. They taught technology to be invisible and actions to be irreversible. But behind this effectiveness always stood the emptiness and cold of laboratories where human life was considered a variable in a complex equation. This experience should serve as a warning. Technological superiority without a moral compass turns progress into an instrument of endless confrontation. Today, we look at these devices as artifacts of a bygone era. But the spirit of those investigations lives on in every new system striving for absolute stealth. Understanding the mechanics of these silent performers gives us a key to understanding the very nature of power and what it is willing to do to maintain its influence. It was a battle of shadows, where the victor was the one whose tool was most organically integrated into the fabric of everyday life. And although the methods have changed, the pursuit of invisible superiority remains one of the driving forces of human history, forcing us again and again to ask, where is the line between protection and threat in a world where even an umbrella may not be what it seems? The complexity of those systems still amazes the imagination today. To create a capsule that was supposed to work strictly at a temperature of 36 6/10 of a degree, knowledge in materials science, which was then considered cutting edge, was required. The use of iridium and platinum was dictated not by luxury, but by the chemical inertness of these metals, which did not react with aggressive compounds inside and did not cause rejection by the body in the first critical minutes. The entire development cycle from idea to field trials could take up to 5 years of intense work by entire institutes. This was an industry working at the limit of human capabilities, where the price of error was equivalent to the complete failure of state policy in an entire direction. Interestingly, many technical solutions of those years found their application in peaceful industries. Micropumps developed for covert delivery systems later became the basis for insulin pumps, saving millions of lives. Passive signal transmission systems without power sources inspired the creators of modern contactless cards and identification tags. This is another paradox. Tools created for the final reckoning ultimately gave impetus to technologies that facilitate our existence. This highlights the ambivalence of human genius, capable of deriving benefit even from the darkest pages of its history. However, it is important not to forget the original purpose of these masterpieces of micromechanics. They were created in an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, when every leader feared for their safety, and special services sought ways to make these fears a reality. The inner world of the developers was a world of numbers, tolerances, and probabilities, where there was no place for sympathy or doubt, only cold calculation and the pursuit of impeccable execution. This was a specific culture where success meant no news and complete silence on the airwaves. Reflecting on the significance of these events for the present day, we understand that the main protection is openness and transparency. The more we know about the methods of hidden influence, the harder it is to use them against us. The history of engineers who were ahead of their time teaches us that progress should not be secret. Hidden technologies always carry the seed of distrust and destabilization. In a world where information spreads instantly, hiding the existence of such devices becomes increasingly difficult. But the temptation to use them is still great. This requires constant control by civil society over developments in dual-use technologies. Ultimately, the history of invisible liquidators is a story of how humanity tried to cheat fate itself, using the latest scientific achievements for this purpose. It is a drama about the search for the perfect weapon, which ultimately became a hostage to its own secrecy. And when we next see an old cane umbrella or an elegant fountain pen from the 40s in an antique shop window, the image of that invisible front will involuntarily emerge in our memory, where every movement was calculated and every object could conceal the finale of a great story. This memory is important so that we appreciate a peaceful life and understand what colossal efforts were made to maintain the fragile balance on the planet during those turbulent times. The cycle of history closes. Those who once created these devices have long since retired, but their ideas continue to live on in new forms. We, looking back through the prism of decades, can only marvel at how far the human mind can go in its pursuit of perfection, even if that perfection is directed towards the creation of silence. This path was full of paradoxes and discoveries that forever changed our world, making it more complex and, perhaps, a little more cautious. That accidental prick on Waterloo Bridge will remain an eternal reminder that the true heroes and anti-heroes of history often hide behind the most ordinary things, and our task is to learn to see the essence behind the outer shell, no matter how familiar and harmless it may seem. In conclusion, it is worth noting that the path of the engineers who worked on these systems was a path of solitude. They could not share their successes with loved ones, nor could they receive societal recognition. Their only reward was the awareness that their mechanisms worked perfectly, like Swiss watches, in the most extreme conditions. This dedication to their work, even if directed towards destructive goals, evokes a strange mix of horror and respect for the capabilities of human intellect. May this knowledge serve as a lesson and a reminder that true wisdom lies in using the power of reason for creation and protection, and not for finding new ways to silently end the human journey.